Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications.
Hi, Ro. Now, California wants to know, did your choice win American Idol last night?
Tim, I don't watch American Idol.
Well, for those who don't, Chase Beckham from California, from Apple Valley, won American Idol last night. And he's kind of I'd say like a rock, kind of a country rock kind of a singer. And who knows if the recent trend of American Idol continues, if we'll ever hear from him again after winning American Idol. But
now, is he your choice?
Well, I would say of the three finalists, I thought going in, he was the most likely to win because his song actually was number one on iTunes for several days. They all recorded their first single on last week's episode. And so, his went to number one. I think, though, that Willie Spence, who was the runner-up, I think he had the better show last night. But ultimately, the voters of American Idol did not agree.
Well, anyway, today's podcast is a conversation with Jorge Galicia. And Jorge was a law student who escaped to Venezuela, and PRI's Evan Harris, who runs our Young Leaders Circle program, interviewed Jorge. Jorge was a student activist trying to bring reforms to Venezuela, but when his fellow students started to disappear, jailed by Venezuela's authoritarian regime, he escaped to the United States. So today he speaks to college audiences around the country about his experience living in Venezuela. And the country first actually started to pursue a socialist agenda with things like free community college and healthcare. So it's interesting that he notes that in the interview. Then, of course, it descended into the dictatorship that we see today. So we thought this interview was appropriate for the times. California has been moving towards socialism for decades now. Some say as far back as the 70s. Today, you can argue that California is the biggest welfare state in the country. We're one of the least free states in the Union, 48th in the most recent ranking by the Cato Institute. And if you look at the U.S. in terms of the rest of the world, the U.S. ranks only 17th, tied with the UK in Cato's Human Freedom Index. So the old saying that the U.S. president is the leader of the free world, well, now he's 17th in line.
Well, I think what's interesting, too, when you listen to Jorge's interview is that we know that around the world throughout history where you've had moves to socialism or communism, it's often, almost always been accompanied by some sort of repression, infringement, not just on economic liberty, but on personal liberty as well. And it's not, I think what Jorge reminds us is, this is not something of the Cold War past. This is something that is happening right now in our lifetime, in our hemisphere. And so when you see, Bernie Sanders getting on his soapbox, advocating for socialism or AOC or others, they're not just benign people pushing for socialist policies. I think we need to fear in this country, we're already seeing kind of an infringement of people's liberties with this expansion of government regulation, government control. Might we see the next step here? Might we fall further than 17th on that Human Freedom Index if, ultimately, the Bernie Sanderses of the world get their way? So I think it's a very interesting interview, and hopefully for the younger people listening to our podcast, a real reminder of this is the reality of socialism.
Well, it's sad, Tim, that California is leading the way here. My parents immigrated to the U.S. in the 1960s. It was the era of Pat Brown here in California. It seemed like the state had limitless prospects, but beginning in the 70s, something changed. I was reading an article this weekend to prepare for this. Our colleague Ed Ring at the California Policy Center called it, the rise of government as a special interest. Government began to expand in a huge way starting in the 70s. And of course, that was followed by the tremendous rise of public unions And over the decades, the public unions amassed such power in the state that it's now strangling freedom and prosperity. You could see the apex of this power during the pandemic. This past year's lockdowns and restrictions, and we have some of the toughest restrictions in the country. And even today, half of California's public school students still are not back in the classroom.
Well, and even before the pandemic, this could be a drinking game for our podcast listeners, but I will say it again. Back in the day when I worked in the legislature, we would deal with these issues all the time. Over the years, certainly over the past 2 decades, you've seen lawmakers, in some cases propose, and in most cases successfully adopt policies that would dictate what kind of business you own, what kind of car you drive, how you raise your children. We've seen most recently, limits on that you can have gas in your house in new home construction. If you want a gas range, basically the building standards have been changed that in new construction, you're not going to be able to have gas in your home to have a gas range, which is better, we know, for cooking. Any chef will tell you that. All of these together, they may not sound like a lot, but they're all an infringement on people's personal liberties. Just
prior to the pandemic, there were a flurry of polls on what Americans think about socialism. And I remember looking at one. It was a Gallup poll. And I like the Gallup poll because Gallup had been consistently taking this poll about what Americans think about socialism over a longer period. So back in 2010, believe it or not, 36% of Americans had a positive view of socialism, but 58% had a negative view. But now, 10 years later, that's all reversed. 58% have a positive view of socialism and 36% have a negative view. And I think a lot of it, Tim, is the kids, California kids being educated in this public school system. And the teachers' unions have really influenced the kids' mindset on the notion of socialism. I thought it was interesting that Jorge Galicia mentions in an interview, again, that programs like free community college and free healthcare began this kind of socialist movement in Venezuela. And here in California, we already have free community college for those who have financial need, but now Biden wants to make it free for everyone. So, and then we've had many attempts to try to make single payer here in California, but so far it's been unsuccessful. But nationally, we've got Bernie Sanders relentlessly trying to march toward Medicare for all.
Well, and you see, hopefully, that when people get educated, they have a very different view. We've seen in the polling when you tell people, do you like single payer healthcare? Well, they like the concept. Then when you tell them what it would mean in terms of taxes, what it would mean in terms of government control over your healthcare decisions, potentially, what it would mean over your ability to choose your own plan or choose your own doctor, people, the support drops in record numbers. We also saw in the last election, many observers thought that Joe Biden had actually a great chance to win the election in Texas and in Florida. But what they weren't counting on was that people who had emigrated from countries like Venezuela, who knew firsthand what socialism meant and should have been, kind of ripe voters for Joe Biden to take, they deserted him in droves. And actually, President Trump won both Florida and Texas. So, there's always the famous ad campaign on NBC, the more you know. Well, I think that's the case with socialism in the United States. The more you know, the less likely you are to support it.
Well, so we're very proud to present Jorge Galicia, and special thanks to Evan Harris, who did this great interview with Jorge. It's a very moving eyewitness account of the dangers of socialism. And in my day, Solzhenitsyn and the Gulag Archipelago was required reading, but it's a different day now, and we need more young people like Jorge to expose socialism for what it is.
And it's one of the many great webinars that Evan has been doing throughout the pandemic with not only young leaders talking about socialism, but young leaders in public public policy, in media, kind of talking about how they got where they were, their career paths, and kind of what makes them tick and the kind of things that they're working on, early in their careers. So we encourage you to go to pacificresearch.org and check out the Young Leaders Circle and keep an eye out for our regular series of Young Leaders series discussions like this one.
And while you're on our website, this is a reminder for listeners to register, save a date for our San Francisco Gala. It's October 2nd. That's a Saturday. Our keynote speaker is Mark Levin. And we're also celebrating the 30th anniversary of PRI's President Sally Pipes on the helm at PRI. So we would love to meet all of our listeners. And of course, we will have fine wine and a big, juicy steak. So thanks, everyone. Here's Jorge and Evan.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us again. We're here for another PRI Young Leaders Circle Speakers Corner. And so this is an ongoing series where we talk to young professionals in government, think tanks, public policy, emerging industries, talking to them, how they got started and what they're doing, or how they came to the field they're studying or their career, and just getting to know more folks that are, free market focused and interested in same ideas as PRI. So today we have a really special guest. I'm really excited to have him on, and he'll kind of tell you this incredible backstory and what he does now. But we have Jorge Galicia with us. Jorge, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you, Evan. Thank you for the invitation and for the opportunity.
Yeah, no. So let's go right in. Maybe right now, tell us where you're at and what you're doing, and then we can get to the really interesting part, your backstory.
All right. So. Well, you already said my name. My name is Jorge Galicia, and I am from Venezuela. And what I'm currently doing here in America is I'm doing basically giving presentations around the States about how socialism devastated my homeland, Venezuela, because I just left that place 2 years ago, and I have a lot of interesting stories to share with the American audience that, fortunately, they don't have lived such a thing. So I think stories like mine can have an impact in the current discussion that you're having in this country right now.
And you've been traveling, and I'm connected with you on Facebook. I mean, you're literally traveling the country. I thought I saw you did upwards of 50 speeches this year, last year, maybe more.
Yeah, the program is being conducted by two speakers. One is me, of course, and the other one is another friend of mine whose name is Andres Guilarte. And both of us have spoken in front of to at least 50 college campuses across the states. In my case, I have been to places like Alabama, Mississippi, Michigan, Minnesota, California, Colorado, Oklahoma, Arkansas. I've been to a lot of places, more than 15 states for me. Wow. In my case, and it has been a really wonderful experience. I have get to know a lot of the American culture, and I had the chance to interact with a lot of students in different places and different locations. So it has been really unique and wonderful.
On a side note, I'm jealous because I haven't even been to that many states. So you definitely have me beat on traveling the country already. So. Oh
yeah. Well, I didn't expect to do something like this when I arrived, honestly. This is like, wow.
Yeah. Well, let's get into, we'll jump to the college stuff in a second, but let's go back to, take us through maybe before you got here, what you're doing in Venezuela, and kind of walk us through up to your arrival to the United States.
Okay. So I came to the United States in the year 2018, and before that, I graduated from law school in Venezuela, in Caracas, Venezuela. And during my time in law school, I basically was a political activist in Venezuela, rooting for freedom, rooting for democracy, because people need to know that in Venezuela we currently have a socialist dictatorship. Mm-hmm. And, since the year 2014, at least I joined the Democratic cause, and I joined the student movement of my university. And I also joined a political party, a classical liberal political party in Venezuela. And, well, that's basically the reason why I'm here today, because in the year 2017, sadly, one of my best friends was captured by the political police in Venezuela because of the activism we were doing. And that situation put me in high danger as well, because both of us were doing exactly the same things at exactly the same time and location. So, I needed to basically disappear, and I needed to go into hiding for a long period of time. I was sent into a religious place. I spent in this place like 3 months, totally isolated, no cell phone, no internet connection, no communication of any kind with the exterior, with anybody outside that place. So it was a really life-changing experience for me. And once my friend was released from prison, I was able to little by little resume a little bit of my ordinary life in Venezuela, but I never got to be the same. So I decided to escape the next year once I finished my law degree in Venezuela, and now I'm here in America claiming asylum. So that's a little bit of my story of why I'm here.
Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, you had started, I think most Americans know the recent events with Venezuela and the U.S. weighing in on the elections and who's legitimate, who's really the leader there. I mean, you had started several years before. Were things always like that when you had started your activism, or did things slowly ramp up?
Well, I can tell you personally. Let me talk to you a little bit about my economics.
Sure.
I came from a middle class family. I think most of my childhood and pretty much majority of the time when I was a teenager, we had a pretty decent life in Venezuela. I mean, we used to go to restaurants. I used to have great birthday parties when I was a child. My family and I used to be really close together. I mean, it was a great time in my life.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I graduated from high school, and when I entered, when I began my law degree, everything changed like so dramatically. This is like in the year 2013, 2014. Those years were like when the actual chaos started at least in my life. For example, in my house, we stopped having like water supply. We stopped having electricity most of the time. Internet connection started to fail basically every single week. And, even food was really hard to come by in Venezuela. We knew in those years, 2014, 2015, we needed to do like really long lines in order to get some pieces of bread or meat, and the prices were like extremely high for us to afford a good nutrition. I mean, our lifestyle changed like completely in a level that we never expected that could ever happen to us. And when that happened, when I saw that transition in my life, I decided to join the political movement, because I knew that the country was heading in a wrong direction, and I wanted to be part of the change, right?
Yeah.
And of course, those years, we were doing a lot of pressure in the street by protesting peacefully, but unfortunately, it didn't have any real effect on trying to change the power now, right? And now that everything we're seeing with Juan Guaido and the interim the presidency that is being like, how do I say it? Like it's being contested by two different persons. That was after I left.
Okay.
So I didn't have a lot to do with that, but yeah, that's kind of my background, and that's why I joined the political movement in Venezuela.
No, that's fascinating. I'm sure I would think most of our viewers and folks who somewhat know foreign politics, foreign affairs, they probably started paying attention the last couple of years, but even before that, I was curious. Obviously, the warning signs were there. Let's talk about. So you're here in the U.S. You're going to campuses now. You're speaking regularly. You're talking about the warning signs you saw. What are maybe one or two big themes or a couple reoccurring points you've noticed when you spoke this year or even last year What are you telling crowds?
Well, I think the biggest similarity I see between Venezuela and America right now, I think, is the inability. If that a word? The inability that you have here, and we also had in Venezuela, of control the levels of spending.
Sure.
I mean, people need to understand that the first major step that Venezuela gave into socialism didn't even happen under Hugo Chavez, but it happened when we were a democracy in the year 1975, when we decided to nationalize the oil industry. That first major step started a process of increasing the national spending in a dramatic way every single year, because the government started to receive like new resources out of nowhere. And in that year also we had a huge boom among the oil prices. So the government received a whole new quantity of resources, and they decided to spend it on creating like social programs, subsidies, and all kind of services provided by the state. You know, a big welfare state was created in Venezuela during this year. But then in the year 1978, this huge boom that we saw with the oil prices came to an end. And that's when our problems actually started to appear. Like we had like big levels of inflation for the very first time in the 80s, because the politicians were not able to cut many of the things that all of the social programs and subsidies that were created during this first 5 years. And then, the only way to maintain those without the huge oil revenue was through printing new money, raising taxes, borrowing new money. So this created like a really bad economic environment, and little by little, the Venezuelan society became poorer and poorer. Yeah. And you have to understand that Venezuela, before this, we used to be the fourth biggest economy of the entire country, of the entire world. We used to be we used to have the greatest GDP in the entire Latin American region. We used to have a better economy than places like China, like Israel, like Spain, Greece. I mean, Venezuela was doing really well. And then because of these bad economic decisions, we ended up having a lot of problems, and we created basically the perfect environment for someone like Hugo Chavez to appear. And he said that he was going to avenge everybody, and he was going to create much more social programs and stuff like that. So we ended up voting for a radical socialist, and now we're paying the consequences of that. But it didn't start because of authoritarian socialism, like people on the left want people to believe here. It started by democratic socialism way back in the 70s. That's when our problems actually started to be visible.
And are there any progressive policies that in the United States that you're seeing that remind you? I think, PRI, we talk a lot about single payer healthcare, Medicare for all, many of the other progressive policies, Green New Deal. Are there any ones that you see, whether it's those or another one that you're like, gosh, that reminds me of the way Venezuela went, or gosh, that reminds me of a policy there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, all of these promises of free college education for everybody, for example, that was a huge one that we had in Venezuela during the 70s, and also the healthcare. The government during this time created more than 20 public hospitals where any Venezuelan could go, regardless of its social economics. Like, you could be poor, you could be rich, it didn't matter. All you needed to do was go to one of these facilities, and there you would receive free medical attention and free medical healthcare. And all of that sounded really well for society, but the problem is it was not sustainable in the long term for us, and it ended up creating a culture of dependency of people like around these services, because not a lot of people knew after this how to be productive without these kind of services provided by the state. And later, when the government realized that it was no longer possible for the government to keep financing these programs, well, it was already too late, because society was already used to it.
Yeah.
So that's the danger. I mean, I think all of these programs sound really, really great, but who's going to pay for it, right? And for how long can you afford to have these kind of programs before a crisis hit? Then that's what we didn't understand that in Venezuela. On time.
I'm curious. So when you've been speaking in the U.S., we can go back to your college visits. I guess maybe when you've spoken to other college students or younger crowd, we know from polling, Medicare for all, some other progressive policies are actually well liked by a lot of polls. Folks approve of them. It's sometimes 50, 60%. When you've gone and done your talks at colleges, when you're talking more to college students, younger folks, do you find that there is maybe more of an acceptance of more progressive policies, or they're more open compared to, or is it everyone's like, no, this is terrible, we can't do it?
Like, can you repeat the question? Like, are they open to my talk, or?
No, more the like a Green New Deal or a progressive policy that leans more toward something a little more socialist. Have you found that folks, when you've done your talk, are they more receptive? Folks in the audience, are they more open to those ideas?
Yeah, generally when I speak, I find a lot of reception in the audience. That has been like the common experience for me.
Sure.
I have found a lot of pushbacks from some students in the audience that tried to say like, hey, but socialism did work in in Norway, for example, or in Sweden or places like this.
Sure.
But I also bring the point that all of these Nordic places are not really socialist. They are free capitalistic nations, and sometimes they have more free market oriented policies than we could have here in America sometimes.
Yep.
So when I make like that case, well, sometimes they acknowledge that, but generally, I think the audience has been welcoming me. I did have a couple of experience in once in University of North Texas, where my flyers were like all vandalized by some radical leftist students there. They didn't like my presence there, of course, and they wrote all kind of things in the flyers, and also in Indiana, in Marian University. There, I was the same experience. Some people, destroyed the flyers and the promotion to the event, but at the end, they didn't show up and they didn't hear what I had to say. So
sure,
there was no chance to have some sort of debate or stuff. But so far, thanks to God, the public has been really receptive and respectful. And I think that when they hear all the things that I've been through, that creates, some sort of respect in between them, I guess.
No, I mean, even if they disagree, having the debate is,
exactly.
Hopefully, a respectful debate is the key and the most important. And
right.
Well, I'm going to put you on the spot. What's the best and the worst place that you've? We'll go with spoke at, and then I'll ask you another one. Like
the best place where I have spoken?
Yeah.
Well,
maybe the nicest, or it was the reception you got, or the people, or.
I mean, that's really interesting because I think every place is different.
Sure.
Like every place I have, kind of. For example, I spoke at. This was in Mississippi. In let me remind the name. Millsaps College.
Okay.
And there it was extremely interesting because I among the audience was a Venezuelan family.
Oh.
And I gave my speech, and after I spoke and I finished my presentation, one of the members of this family, she stand up and she started to say her own personal story with socialism. So basically she confirmed everything I was telling, and she started crying because she needed to leave Venezuela in a horrible way, like walking through the border with all of her her luggage and her family walking as well. I mean, it was something really, really impactful. And when people having the chance of I mean, the student had the chance to hear me and also hear the confirmation of someone else who happened to be there, who confirm everything. And I think that was a really beautiful moment to experience.
Absolutely.
And yeah, but I have also spoken on other places like at Reagan Center in Santa Barbara. I love that place. Like, I mean, for me, it was an honor to be speaking in a place with so much history, and where, I mean, I love Ronald Reagan and all he did for America and the world. So, I mean, it's having the chance of speaking a place like this was like unique for me. But every place has like a different story to tell, and I always do like connections and friends in every place I go, and I always stay in touch with the people I meet. So I think it has been a wonderful experience for me.
Well, that's good. That's a good approach to have, I guess, is find enjoyment wherever you go. And PRI has a lot of former, I guess I'm dating them, Reagan alumni from the administration. So they'll be happy to hear that you.
Yeah, actually,
last
week I spoke at Rancho del Cielo itself, like at the house itself. Yeah, this was not like in front of students, but it was like a group of members of a club, the Lincoln Club in Orange County.
Yeah,
they had like a retreat there, and they invited me to as a speaker. So it was like a wonderful opportunity for me to speak at the rancho itself. It was like, wow.
No,
I never expect. Yeah.
So let's go a little. Let's say there's someone, maybe they're in the U.S., maybe there's someone else. Either they want to be an activist or they want to start speaking. What advice would you give them? What input, feedback based on your journey?
Well, for me, it was all about the network. The networking. Honestly, I never expected I was going to be doing stuff like this when I arrived to the U.S. But because of the connections I had in Venezuela, I was part of an organization named Students for Liberty.
Sure.
And I did a lot of friends there. I did a lot of connections because of the activism that I was doing with them. And basically, that was the reason that I got connected with the Fund for American Studies in the first place. And they reached to me and they say, "Hey, we want to do this project. We were looking for some Venezuelan guy to start sharing his story and telling American audiences about Venezuela and how Venezuela became such a horrible place, and how did it transform from being a wonderful country to being what it is today, right?" And that I never expected that to happen, but I think I'm gonna say that this was because of networking. People that really want to do the activism and have a nice story to tell. I think the first step is to get involved with political organizations, with think tanks, and talk to people. And at any moment someone will find your story interesting, and you're going to have chance to speak, to give an interview, maybe to speak in front of somebody. I mean, that's what it takes. That's what it took for me, in my opinion, because
no, that's great advice. I think that echoes in so many lines of work in different industries of your network, and just being willing to meet people, really talk to them. So that's great. Well, I'll give you the last word and parting thoughts if you'd like to go.
Well, as I always say, I'm gonna give like a little advice for the audience. I think people really need to care about the levels of spending here in America, because I see how the deficit levels are increasing every single year, regardless of which party is in control of the federal government. We see how the presidency and the Congress keeps flipping between Republicans and Democrats, and apparently that doesn't even matter anymore, because the deficit just keeps growing and growing and growing.
Yep.
And eventually, I believe that if you don't control this, and if you don't find a way to balance the budget, you will see yourself in a really bad economic situation. And who knows? In Venezuela, one of the main reasons that we got into Hugo Chavez was because we were unable to control the levels of spending on time. This created a horrible crisis, economic crisis, and people wanted someone to fix that, and they choose the worst candidate possible. So I don't want to see something like that happening here. And of course, that's the worst scenario. I'm not saying that that's what's going to happen here. I mean, but you could have other scenarios like Argentina, like Greece. I mean, history is full of examples of societies that collapse or because they just were not able to control their levels of spending on time. So that's my main message right now, what I'm trying to give to the audiences, like care about the spending. And I think the Republican leadership needs to hear this, because I think fiscal responsibility is somehow being left apart of the agenda. I didn't even hear it a lot at the RNC convention. So that's worrisome. Especially
this year with, the stimulus checks.
Exactly.
It was a lot of money that was in the Fed. Yeah. So no, that's great advice. So, well, Jorge, thank you for being here. It was wonderful hearing from you, your story. I think like when I reached out to you, when we first talked last year, I was just blown away. Like we were networking and I started talking to you and I was like, it's a great story. And I think the fact that you can share it, and folks can hear firsthand, coming from Venezuela, I think we all hope it goes back to, a democratic society where, you and folks that have had to leave can go home. So that's my dream, to go back eventually. Absolutely. Well, thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it.
All right. Take care.
Okay. Bye.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.